Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the second day of the NHS Providers Annual Conference and Exhibition themed around resilience. I hope those of you who were with us yesterday had an enjoyable evening, and welcome to those of you who've just joined us for today. A really interesting programme for today as well. A few bits of housekeeping for those who are joining us. First of all, thanks again to all of our partners and exhibitors for their support. I do encourage you to make time to visit the exhibition and, of course, look out for the Delivering with Partners sessions. A particular word of thanks this morning to MIH Solutions, who kindly sponsored the lanyards for this event, and MIAA for sponsoring the registration desk. We really do appreciate it. As you will have known if you were here yesterday, we've been using Glisser for taking questions as well as submitting in the room. Unfortunately, the whole of Glisser is down. I know we've been discussing the use of innovation and technology in the NHS. So at the moment, just assume that we'll be using kind of microphones in the auditorium for your chance to put questions. And if that changes, I'll let you know. We're also encouraging conversation on Twitter and LinkedIn, so please do post using the hashtag NHSP22, and you can tag us at NHS Providers. And just so you know, there's a photographer on site, and at all the plenary sessions, the sessions will also all be recorded and live streamed to NHS Providers, the website, and around the conference venue. Photographs and footage may be used on our website and social media channels. No fire alarm tests expected today, so should the fire alarm sound, a verbal announcement will follow, made via the public address system. Please follow the instructions from the stewards. Make your way to the nearest fire exits. And finally, please can I ask you to keep your mobile phones all on silent during all the events. So we have a particularly good day lined up today. A keynote speech from NHS England Chief Executive Amanda Pritchard, a keynote from Health Education England Chief Executive and Chief Workforce Officer at NHS England Navina Evans, and also a panel discussion on inclusive leadership for a resilient NHS. But first of all, I'm delighted to welcome to the stage the Right Honourable Steve Barclay MP, Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Samira, and good morning, everyone. A lot has clearly happened since the last NHS Providers Conference took place, including, of course, several changes of Secretary of State. And I know that might not matter to everyone in the room, as ministers do change, but I wanted to start by just assuring you that the challenges that you're facing are uppermost in the thinking of this government. And having previously held roles in Number 10, in the Cabinet Office, in the Treasury, one of the things I can bring to this role is making sure on your behalf that the very real challenges that I know you face will be given the utmost visibility in the discussions that take place at the centre of government. And in contrast to what some may have read in the papers over the weekend, I have been very clear in setting out the extent of those challenges, in shaping the context of the Chancellor's statement to the House tomorrow. I'm very much looking forward to working with colleagues here and across the health and social care sector, which is an important part of all of our family story. And I am no exception in that. My very first memory as a child was when my mum was doing cleaning work in a caring home, and I went along, and part of the reason I remember it so well was the kindness of the elderly residents who used to treat me to lots of biscuits as a very little child and treated me so well when I was there. And that kind and caring environment has always struck and stayed with me. And I believe in explaining sort of how that has manifested itself. It is far better to show, not tell. And for any that cared to look at my record during my 4 years as a member of the Public Accounts Committee, you will see that I was a very strong champion for NHS staff who raised issues of patient safety. Because I've always felt very strongly that listening to and learning from staff is critical to improving outcomes for patients. Now, I know I'm speaking against an extremely difficult backdrop. We're all conscious of the fiscal statement from the Chancellor and the wider economic challenges caused by two once-in-a-100-year events happening within the space of 3 years in the form of the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. And indeed, that places constraints on pay and creates the backdrop of industrial action, along with the pressures you face as local leaders. And in these difficult times, I'm extremely keen to work with you on identifying all the practical measures that we can put in place to support the NHS and care workforce. And if I can make the point more explicitly, when people ask what my priorities are for the NHS, then supporting the workforce is first amongst those priorities. Now, we know that this will be one of the toughest winters in the 74-year history of the NHS. And I fully understand why a survey ahead of this conference by NHS providers showed that 85% of trust leaders are more worried about this winter than any in their NHS career. We face the twin threats of COVID and flu, the huge external pressures around energy and cost of living. We enter the colder months without the breathing space that we might usually have had over the summer, and I'm sure colleagues were more used to at earlier stages in their career. And due to the COVID pressures, which have remained high, that has continued that pressure. So there's a huge amount to do together to steer health and care through this storm, and crucially make the changes that will make us better prepared for the future. I'm extremely grateful for everything that you have done so far in these difficult conditions, working hard to get more nurses on the front line and to meet those challenges. And we, within government, through our manifesto commitment to recruit 50,000 more nurses, are recognising the extent of those pressures and working with you. We'll do everything we can to protect the NHS this winter through the booster programme, more staff on the NHS 111 and 999. And within the Department of Health and Social Care itself, our focus is very much on what practical measures we can take to support you. As an example, when I was Minister for the Cabinet Office, I was surprised to discover that we had over 60 strategies across Whitehall just for science and technology. And there may be some here who feel they're often asked to contribute to long-term plans at the expense of time spent on more immediate pressures. Well, my focus will be on the areas that matter most to patients and workforce, and working with you on those practical measures of support. And so alongside workforce, a second priority will be on our recovery plan. With a backlog of 7.1 million, we will relentlessly focus on the elective recovery work that is being led by Jim Mackey and delivered by you as chief executives and chairs. Amanda and I want to see the department and NHS England working closely together on these shared priorities. And as part of that close working, Amanda and I are pleased to announce two important appointments today who will work closely across both the department and NHS England. So I'm pleased to say that Professor Sir Tim Briggs, who a number of you in this room will know very well, and who is one of the nation's most highly regarded orthopaedic surgeons, will bring his considerable clinical expertise to a new role as clinical lead for elective recovery across that programme, taking on a broader role as well as his leadership of Get It Right First Time and his clinical practice. I can also announce that Sarah Jane Marsh will be taking up the role of Deputy Chief Operating Officer and National Director for Urgent and Emergency Care. She will work closely with regional teams and integrated care systems to deliver our transformation of urgent and emergency care and make sure patients get the right care in the right place at the right time. Sarah Jane will replace Pauline Phillip, who I'd like to thank for her dedicated service since 2015. Now, initiatives like Get It Right First Time and Sarah Jane's work over the summer on the 100-day discharge task force sprint have been making good progress in better using data to prioritise and address variations in performance between areas. We took together an extremely positive step over the summer with the 2-year waits being virtually eliminated And as we focus on the next steps of hitting the 78-week target by April 2023, we will work with you as trust leaders to more quickly scale best practice. Now, this summer, I saw how problems often manifest themselves in one part of a complex system, but are caused elsewhere. For instance, I know that issues that we are seeing around delayed discharge are a symptom of a broader pressure across health and care. So to support this work, we have launched a £500 million adult social care discharge fund to help get people who do not need to be on wards and where this damages their health out of hospital and into social care. Today, I'm pleased to announce details of the fund, which will be provided to ICBs and local authorities to free up beds at a time when bed occupancy is at 94%, and to improve capacity for social care. The first tranche will be provided by early December, and the second will be distributed at the end of January. In line with our devolved and data-driven approach, we will allow local areas to determine how we can speed up discharge of patients out of hospital, and this might be through purchasing supportive technology, through boosting domiciliary care capacity, or funding physiotherapists or occupational therapists to support recovery at home. Meanwhile, we will also be looking at the impact of how funding is used and using this data to inform future decisions on funding, including a more compelling evaluation capacity to help those discussions with the centre of government. Now, tackling delayed discharge must be an effort that spans a number of different areas across health and care, with social care, primary care, community services all working together with hospitals. I want to move away from blame being attached to particular parts of the system for problems that arise but are the consequences of issues that have arisen elsewhere in that complex system. So delayed discharge needs to be much more of a team effort where everyone plays their part and where decisions on where risk sits within a local system are best made by those closer to the issue. Equally, I am sure you can appreciate that quite often as a Secretary of State, being held accountable for individual operational failure, it can feel far removed from the day-to-day decisions made at a local level. And it is far better that variation in the different needs of demographies and local healthcare systems is reflected in more devolved decisions to local leaders, who, of course, are far better placed to assess the trade-offs about where risk best sits within those systems, rather than it being determined in some one-size-fits-all ministerial office. So a key direction of travel will be to empower the ICBs much more to harness advances around population-level data, with the role of the centre being geared around supporting areas to address those variations in performance, of which, of course, you will all play a large part. We will support trusts in stopping lower priority spend so they can prioritise areas that matter most to patients like cancer care. And we will also show more transparency from the centre about how our own resources are being deployed to ensure this spend better aligns with fewer targets and more ICB autonomy. We're, again, showing, not telling in that regard, and so providing transparency of department spend for the Department of Health and Social Care and our central arm's length bodies, which, it's worth remembering, accounts for £2.8 billion of spend. And the department, along with the vast majority of our ALBs, have now published searchable organograms showing all job titles and the number of people working in each team. So you, as health leaders, can see more clearly where resource is spent at the centre. And we can start a conversation about whether priorities and resource is best aligned with supporting you in meeting the challenges that your local health system faces. I'd like to touch also briefly on pay, which I know is an important issue for your teams. As in all sectors, pay is a central issue, particularly given the wider cost of living pressures. And I'm keen to work constructively with trade union colleagues, and indeed last week I met with the Royal College of Nursing, and yesterday I held a roundtable with a wide range of trade unions, discussing the issues that they raised on patient safety, non-pay benefits, and of course, pay itself. But I do not think it is realistic that increases should be 3 times the amount paid to those outside the private sector. And the over £9 billion cost this would entail would impact other areas of spend, such as buildings and technology, which are also important to staff. However, I'm grateful for the discussions that we had over the past few weeks and look forward to future discussions. And I've made clear my door is open and we want to engage constructively. And I can assure you that this is an issue I'm determined to take forward. Turning to GP access, which is another key priority. Because when it comes to people's direct experience of the NHS, over 90% of that experience is through primary care. So addressing the 8 a.m. morning scramble, opening access to appointments is a key area of focus and indeed was a key component of the plan for patients. We know there's no single solution, and we'll be looking to ensure that we have a wider workforce for primary care. We'll be looking at the skills mix in primary care, creating more appointments for patients, rolling out the extra phone lines, looking at how we progress pharmacy first, exploring ways to do things differently, such as new areas like home testing, and redesigning patient pathways so that all the burden doesn't fall on GPs. Another priority is ensuring a stronger future for health and care in terms of how we use the latest technologies and trends to improve patient outcomes and to make sure that taxpayers' money is well spent. And one example of that is on the NHS estate. I know there are huge concerns about issues in terms of the rack concrete used in certain hospitals, which needs urgent attention. And I want to speak very directly to the chief executives of all the hospital trusts that are affected. I understand the seriousness of this issue, and I am committed to delivering the government's commitment to eradicating rack from the NHS estate. Equally, there has been great interest in the wider New Hospitals Build programme, and Saffron, I know that you've talked a lot about the importance of our capital programme to the longer-term future of the NHS, and I couldn't agree more. I want to use the opportunity of this biggest hospital building programme in a generation to think differently about how we approach the NHS estate. It's important to bear in mind that if you look at the last if you look at the last 10 hospitals, 9 of the last 10 hospitals built in England were over time and over budget. It interests me that, given where we are, 4 years ago as Minister of State in the department, I visited the Royal Liverpool Hospital, which I was told 4 years ago was near completion when on my visit to that hospital. And then 4 years later, I'm now visiting again today, with it only opening last month. So there is an urgent need to change how all NHS buildings are constructed in the future. And this means moving away from bespoke designs by local trusts, and instead having national standardised designs built through modern methods of construction, where the construction time on site is much quicker, the operational performance is delivered quicker, the environmental features are better integrated into the build, and the central evaluation process within government, which to date has been a sticking point for many trusts, can be streamlined because of the greater consistency of design. Whilst COVID has left us with many challenges, it's also shown us that there are new ways of working which could apply. And one of the most important of those opportunities is around better use of the NHS app, which should be much more central to how people access health services. I very much welcome that so many GPs are now making their patient records and testing results available on the NHS app, and I think there are significant opportunities to harness the NHS app further, particularly around the context of pressures in primary care, but more widely on preventative medicine. And we have some big updates to come, including from the end of this month, allowing people to book their COVID jab through the NHS app. But I also want to look at how we make greater use of patient data in a safe and secure way to power life-changing medical research and cement our nation's status as a science superpower. I want patients to have more opportunities to share data on an opt-in basis, to support our great universities, startups, scale-ups who are making incredible breakthroughs, and through cloud computing, machine learning, and the Internet of Things, allow for data to be used and interrogated in new ways. This can give us a competitive advantage when it comes to attracting tech pioneers and researchers in the future of health, but also help us deliver more effective, personalised care for patients. This has to sit, of course, alongside basic improvements, like the electronic patients record being rolled out more quickly, and the poor Wi-Fi coverage that remains too often a frustration for staff. No one is here, I'm sure, is in any doubt as to the size of the challenge that we collectively face. We have to deal with pressures from flu and COVID this winter, substantial backlogs from the pandemic, the wider cost of living challenge faced by our workforce. And so as a result, my key areas of focus in the months ahead will be first and foremost supporting our workforce, focusing forensically on our recovery plans across electives, urgent and emergency care, including the issue of tackling delayed discharge, and primary care access. Alongside this, we need to fix the issue in terms of the RACs, and we need to maintain momentum on the new hospital build programme, in particular, streamlining the central approval process, and invest in tech so we can make it easier to deliver good patient outcomes and better harness our approach on preventative medicine in a way that incentivises patients to provide data for our scientific community, who in turn enable those treatments to be personalised and pathways to be streamlined. I will play my part to try and reduce the number of top-down requests that you face, devolve decision-making to a greater degree, and allow those closest to the patient to better balance how risk is addressed, given the complex landscape in which you all work. And I will set a much higher bar within government to any new legislation, which so often creates undue distraction. Thank you once again for everything that you do. I'm very much looking forward in this role to working with you to build a more resilient, healthier NHS for the long term, so that collectively we can give the security to the people we represent and knowing it will be there for them when they need it most. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Secretary of State. I'm going to take questions from you in the auditorium very shortly. Just two things I wanted to follow up that were in your comments just now. One is obviously this whole issue of hospital discharge. You mentioned more resources for NHS 999 as well as 111. Ambulance trusts are working flat out to deliver for patients, but the patient flow through hospitals is so challenging. What action are you taking to ensure that those people who are medically fit to be discharged are able to return home or get to an appropriate care setting?
Well, that was one of the key things I was seeking to address in the remarks. Firstly, the 500 million, which will allow us to do much more, particularly in areas like domiciliary care. And It's recognising that what manifests itself as a problem in ambulances is often caused elsewhere in the complex system. So it's the blockage in the pipe in terms of delayed discharge that is then creating pressure on the hospitals, which then manifests itself in unmet need actually from ambulances that are not able to get out to the patient. So part of it is being clear within government and the additional funding to target delayed discharge and working with the local authorities as well as the ICBs in terms of how we get a better sense of the flow of the patient through the data and integrating that data, but financially supporting that. It's also then looking at the other areas where blockage occurs, so the pressure on the A&E, where risk sits in the system, how we have better demand management upstream. So the point being is what often will drive sort of media inquiries is the ambulance that's unable to turn up or the very long handover delay. But I think colleagues in this room will be very clear that actually the cause of that is often elsewhere in the system. It's the delayed discharge, which is in part social care, but not solely social care. And sometimes one can see, for example, in hospitals that at the weekend discharge drops. So the question is what is within the trust sound control, pharmacy, consultants of the weekend, what can they do? Often you get specific issues, palliative care, dementia, Parkinson's. So it's a question of being quite targeted. What are we doing on the mental health side as well? So there's often a range of factors, but it's the ambulances that often dominate the headlines.
Yeah. Other big issue, one of many, is the high number of vacancies in the NHS. What steps are you taking to address those? And particularly, you're very aware of the need for long-term rather than short-term planning. Yeah. Can we expect to see a fully funded long-term workforce plan in the near future?
Yeah. No, it's an absolutely fair issue, and it's something I absolutely hear from colleagues. Is a key thing that came up with my discussions with the trade unions. And so, again, there's no single sort of magic bullet on that. It's a range of things. So one of the things in terms of the immediate pressure that I did in the summer during my short time was to really look at how we boost international recruitment. It's not the long-term solution, but just as a recognition of those immediate pressures. Obviously, we are recruiting more, 9,000 more nurses than last year. We opened 5 new medical undergraduate schools. That was one of the things the Chancellor, when he was in my role, did. So we're trying to boost that, but that obviously takes time to come through. We're looking at how we best use the full skills mix. So if in GPs, for example, what are the things that don't necessarily need to be done by the GP, and how do we enable people to operate who have got a range of skills and get patients to them. It's looking at what we can do in new pathways. So we saw the announcement from Amanda in terms of GPs directly referring to diagnostic centres. I mentioned in my remarks looking at the opportunities around technology, around home testing, and how that can then look at different pathways. Of course, there's work by people like Tim Ferriss around on the tech side, and there's work streams on machine learning and other areas where that can relieve pressure. So the point is there's a whole range of things we need to do. I absolutely hear from colleagues in terms of the pressure on workforce, and that's one of the areas we're really keen to work with trusts, with local leaders. I think we all recognise that some of these things take time. It takes 10 years to train a GP, so some of these things take time, but what are the things we can do that allow staff? And again, I mentioned Wi-Fi. One of my visits in the summer, it's quite interesting, the surgeon was saying we're wasting 15 minutes every Monday morning waiting to upload our images. So it's just thinking about where are there things which are taking time from staff, not enabling them to do what they really want to be focused on, and how can we work with local leaders to get the right prioritisation into those areas.
One thing that came up yesterday just on nursing in particular was bursaries and financial support, so that they're not worried about student debt.
Well, part of that is then a question within the things where there's a cost, and there is around bursaries. There's, likewise, government's very committed to apprenticeships and looking at how we get more apprentices in. And again, one of the challenges then is usually around backfill and the costs of that. So part of it is working with local leaders around the prioritisation. Where do we get the best bang for the buck? What is it that we want to prioritise? And the point I was making in the context of pay is actually, it's not simply pay is an important issue, but obviously the estate, tech, some of the other issues are also factors that impact retention and recruitment. So we've got to focus on the full gamut of those.
Thank you. So in the time we have with Secretary of State, nice brief questions, please. If you want to put your hand up, we'll get a microphone to you. I can see there's one down here near the very front, but put your hand up. Number 1, have you got one there? Yes. There was definitely one down here, number 2. We'll take number 2 first if you're ready. I saw a hand down near the front there, somewhere otherwise. Yes, go ahead. We'll take number 2 first, thank you, and then I'll take number 1. Hello.
Hi, I'm Georgina Dean from Black Country Healthcare. Very disappointing that throughout your speech you didn't make any mention of mental health, and it wasn't on your list of priorities. Given you also said that there'll be less funding for low priority areas, should we be worried about the mental health investment standard and less focus on mental health?
So mental health, of course, is critical. It's partly why the government is boosting funding for it. It's something that Theresa May had particularly focused on. Probably one of the NHS England leaders I meet most frequently is Claire Murdoch in my sort of brief tenure. So I've had a series of meetings there. We're very focused on mental health, not least in light of the urgent question last week and some of the issues that arose in inpatient units. And one of the things I've been talking to Maria Caulfield quite a bit around is the paucity of data to better sort of identify those issues in terms of those inpatients, and we're looking very closely at that. Also, of course, workforce actually in mental health has increased. I think 16% over 4 years from memory, but colleagues in the room will know the precise figure, but certainly the increase there. And we've more to do, but we've got a quarter of the schools now covered in terms of the mental health support, because again, I think one of the things we recognise in mental health is around half of cases, I think around 50% of cases manifest by the age of 15. And so one of the things on mental health is getting much more focus on early care, early support and prevention. I think it's a bit like with any speech, if you go through every area within, it becomes, at least what I was trying to give a sense of is, within workforce, obviously mental health is part of that workforce. And part of the urgent question and the issues we're looking at is, what are we doing across the workforce? Now, I didn't list every single item of every area of workforce, but obviously the mental health workforce is a key component of my number one priority. So, there's a lot of work. Parliament was focused on this last week. I had a series of meetings over the last week on mental health, and I've commissioned work, as I say, through the relevant minister in my department, particularly looking, in fact, I was having text messages on it this morning, just in terms of the inpatient care units and what's going on there.
Thank you so much. Number one, am I right? There was a question with number one? Or did I imagine that? Right. Right, we've got another one, number two, down the front here. And then I'll come to number one. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, James Owen from Health Service Journal. You suggested at the beginning of your speech that the reports over the weekend that you've been arguing to the Chancellor that the NHS does not need more money were wide of the mark. Can you just clarify your stance? Because obviously that was quite a significant briefing on the NHS's financial position and whether it needs more money to help counter inflation. Obviously, it's the autumn statement tomorrow, and not expecting you to sort of preempt any of that, but just in terms of your view of whether the NHS does need the extra funding or not, just to sort of clarify after the confusion over the weekend.
Thank you.
Good. Well, it's a great question, and I'm very pleased to have it, because actually it's a great proof point for colleagues in the room, because for those that read the story, they said that that it was my view that the NHS didn't need any more money to meet inflation. Firstly, that is completely incorrect, and we had told the journalists that it was incorrect, but the story was wrong nonetheless. And the good thing about this, Samira, is colleagues in the room will be able to see tomorrow. So I can assure you the Treasury wouldn't allocate any money to the department if the department said it didn't need it, given the fiscal situation we face. So in short, of course, we face significant financial pressures. And inflation is there. I've been having a lot of discussion with Amanda and Julian over recent weeks. I've been having a lot of discussion with the Chancellor. I think actually one of the things I'm able to bring to this role, having been Chief of Staff in Number 10, having been the Minister responsible for spending in the Treasury, and having been the Minister for the Cabinet Office, is actually a very good understanding as to how best to make the case for the Department of Health, and also in terms of our care sector, in terms of making that case to the centre. So firstly, I can absolutely confirm that we do need support to meet those inflationary pressures. And secondly, coming back to, I said in the speech, show not tell, and I think it's probably just useful for local leaders, because sometimes I'm sure in my tenure as Secretary of State, things will be written which won't reflect my view. That's kind of goes with the train in politics. And perhaps it's useful when you see tomorrow whether it is true that we don't get a penny, and I've not asked for a penny. When you see tomorrow whether that is true or not, I hope you'll just bear that in mind when in the future you also see stories which may not completely align with what we're doing in the department.
Thank you. I want to take one more question, number one. Thank you.
Jack Tarsing, Coventry and Warwick Partnership Trust, Mental Health Trust in the Midlands. I'm going to be cheeky and ask you two questions.
Oh, no, just one question, please, just
They're going to be short.
To be fair.
Number one, capital. Decades of underinvestment in capital is leading to inequalities and poor patient care. The second one, can you assure us that government will speak with one voice around health inequalities, which will drive some of the efficiencies if we're given the funding to deal with inequalities, that will deliver efficiencies.
Thank you. So a question about health inequalities.
Health inequalities is something that really interests me because I represent an area in the Fells where the health inequalities compared to Cambridge are very stark. And I think the key there, firstly, is that we're very data-driven and make sure that we're better aligning our targeting of resource with where they're most needed and being, so having a very data-informed approach. And that means looking at things on a population level and working much more closely with the ICBs to empower them to then target that health inequality. And things like the Federated Data Platform obviously will be an important tool to do that. So I think the health inequalities issue is hugely important. I think that also is really important to a government that is committed to levelling up. But also, and I'd perhaps relate it to this thing about making the case more effectively to Treasury. So I think one of the things, in my view, is making that case on levelling up and health inequalities in the context that health is actually a barrier to economic growth because it is leading to a lot of people being out of the labour market at a time when there are constraints on labour supply. Now that's a different argument to, I think, sometimes the way the case has been made to the centre before, but I think it will be a more effective argument rather than it being simply a health case. Actually, what we're making is a much wider case on health and economics. And I had a very good discussion with Andy Haldane, for example, last week with his Bank of England background and DLUC background about how we actually make a wider case that it's a health case, but I think we're more likely to get support by actually also demonstrating the wider benefit to the economy.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions. Thank you so much, Secretary of State, for coming to address NHS providers today. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Right. Right, we're going to move straight on to one. I won't sit down then. Thank you. That could have been a great comedy moment, so I spared it. All right, our next session is on inclusive leadership for a resilient NHS. And this session is exploring leadership in the NHS, looking ahead to the implementation of the recommendations from Sir Gordon Messenger's recent review of health and social care leadership. We're going to focus particularly in this session on the need to embed inclusive leadership practice and promote the values of equality, diversity and anti-racism in leadership to help support the resilience of the NHS and the well-being of its workforce. We're going to discuss the challenges and the opportunities for trust leaders and explore innovative ways to improve performance and bring about change in the best interests of patients and the dedicated staff who care for them. We have a really good panel, so please do give them a welcome. I'm going to introduce them all. We're still swapping over, I think, one of the microphones, but we're joined by Christina Quinn, who's Director for Leadership and Management Implementation Review, NHS England, by Tracy Jolliffe, who's the Head of Inclusive Leadership and Development at NHS England, by Matthew Taylor, who's Chief Executive of the NHS Confederation, by Tricia Pereira, who's the Director of Operations Skills for Care, and by Dr. Peter Redding, who's the co-chair, the Disabled NHS Directors Network. So I'd like to welcome you all on stage. Let me know when I just some water as well. Right. I think the idea is that each of you will speak for about 5 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion, and then we'll take questions from the auditorium. So, Christina first.
Lovely to see you all. And I'm the warm-up act, giving a overview and a little bit of insight around the Messenger review, or to give it its full title, which I think is really important, leadership for a collaborative and inclusive future. And I anticipate, and it's not very often I say this about big reviews, that you will have all read it, because it is an absolutely beautifully written and crafted review. And I don't know about you, but it really spoke very personally to me around some of the things, some of the challenges, some of the huge opportunities that we have in the space of inclusive leadership and management and for our future. And you'll be aware that it was published in June, and it focused on the strengths. This was a really important thing to say to you all around strengths-based reviews, and the key interfaces with our colleagues in social care, which is the most important thing, especially as we are really moving and motoring with our integrated care systems and understanding what that alignment really means for us in terms of leaders and managers. And you'll know it identified 7 recommendations, which I'll just share with you now, specifically the 7 recommendations that you can see here now. And I just want to say a couple of things about those recommendations. One of the key things that Sir Gordon and Dame Linda found as they were talking, and they spoke to an awful lot of people, in fact they may have spoken to some of you guys in the room as well, is there is excellent best practice out there. And as part of the implementation, our role is to highlight that best practice, is to look at where we've got best practice and where we can see that best practice in action through ourselves and through our people and through our teams. But what they also identified, and this is the thing that we need to be concerned about as NHS leaders, is that was patchy. It wasn't the same for everybody. It wasn't the same for everybody in the organisations, in the systems, in the teams, and the people that they spoke to spoke about that quite candidly with them. And I invite you to ask yourselves, where you've got best practice, is that fair? Is that equitable? Is that experience shared by all in your organisations? And really seek out the people who tell you that it's not, and ask them the reasons why and why not there. And here are some of the things that people told through the review. And the most important thing is around the patient is first in everything. The patient, the citizen, the business of caring, the compassion, the kindness. But there were also elements in the review there around that it's not fair and that not everybody have access. That this work really leads to better outcomes, better patient care, better workforce experience, retention, all the things that we know that really great leadership and management involves. And I think probably as we all sit, and I stand here as well, we'll all have personal experiences of this. This isn't something that's done in a dark room. Being a leader and a manager is hard, isn't it? And at the moment, it's really tough. And it's really tough to be very focused on values and outcomes and behaviours based on equality, diversity and inclusion. But it's essential. And in the review candidly states it is the only way to improve services is through that lens. I just want to share with you, this slide looks a bit busy. I hope you can see it clearer on your screen than mine. But to show and to demonstrate and to offer you that all the recommendations are singular in their approach, but are absolutely joined together, starting with induction and recommendation 1, and recommendation 7 is about getting the best talent into the most challenged systems. They are all connected. They are all interconnected there. And I think it's fair to say the implementation team do not stand and sit here thinking we're going to tell you what and how to do. We most definitely aren't. We're going to support the identification of frameworks and best practice so that you can apply what you already have in the system, what you already see going on, and the fantastic work going on in your organisations. One piece of work we've already started, most of you will have completed something for us for this, is looking at a stock take about what's happening in your organisations and your systems already. And there are literally hundreds and hundreds of things that are going on. So the real internal and interesting question is, with everything that you're doing, where and at what points does it make the difference to the staff? Where and at what points does it unleash the ability for the experiences, the good experiences, to be shared for and by all the workforce? Yeah. And I've got one final thing to share with you. It's all very it's personal, this, isn't it? It's always personal. Our work about leadership and management is always personal. And I promise myself every opportunity I get, I'll talk about Colin. And Colin is my brother-in-law, my brother. And he was beautifully cared for by University College Hospital, London, and you can see him there. I've known Colin since he was 14, so he's more than a brother-in-law, he's a brother. And you can see him there with my sister and family and 3 boys. And Colin died 18 months ago of lymphoma that he had, well, in his mind, he had a very successful bone marrow transplant because it gave him an extra year with his family. So leadership and management and our business isn't just about a policy and a document and a piece of paper. We live and breathe it, don't we? And we live and breathe it for the millions of Collins out there and the millions of our staff. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Tracy. Over to you, Tracy. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Great. I'm Tracy, Head of Inclusive System Development for NHS England. I was part of the messenger review that Christina was talking about, and I was in that team and experienced the empowering leadership of General Sir Gordon Messenger and Dame Linda Pollard, and the ways in which diverse voices were both listened to and positively responded to. One of the outcomes of creating such a climate was that the messenger review centred equality, diversity and inclusion. That was no coincidence. So I'm going to talk about racial equity, a subject that is core to us making the improvements in the NHS, retaining staff, attracting a new and motivated workforce to the NHS. And I'm going to speak about building inclusive leadership capabilities that relate to racial justice and equitable practices across health and care. The pace of change towards justice in the workforce has been painfully slow. This journey is often thwarted by unexamined thinking, expectations and standards that are too low, and outdated leadership practices that are unlikely to bear the anticipated fruit of racial justice and social justice. Because the seeds of the values of the NHS Constitution only germinate with the fertile soil of inclusive leadership practice. We'll deliver the Messenger Review Recommendation 2 that relates to EDI if we purposefully set out to locate and then to part company with those outdated thinking and practices that we have in this space, replacing these with practices and actions that lead to racial justice for the health and care workforce, for patients and for communities. Historic approaches to leadership development haven't adequately built the kinds of knowledge and capabilities that will dismantle systemic racial injustice. In order to do this, I'm going to propose 3 essential practice shifts. Of course, there are more. And these shifts and others have been incorporated into the NHS England's leadership development offer called the Building Leadership for Inclusion Initiative that targets NHS trust boards and ICBs. So going on to the practice shifts. Practice shift 1. Creating racial justice initiatives must centre the experiences of those who are targeted by racism. and use those lived experiences as the most important and credible barometer of progress. When racial justice efforts don't improve the experiences of those who are racially minoritized, leaders can learn from this and make adjustments that improves their effectiveness. This requires leaders at all levels to continually test their anti-racist practices for their impact. It's not enough to speak about values. The work has to make a difference to those we claim to be doing this work in service of. So how are we going to measure for these more subtle experiential shifts that tell us that we're online going forward? Practice shift 2. What does equipping and building anti-racist capabilities in our leaders look like? 5 points. Leaders who understand how systemic racism works and can detect and address racism in its most subtle forms. Leaders who are equipped with appropriate language and anti-racist lexicon and can use that language as an effective tool for change. Leaders who are skilled at having conversations across racial difference about racism in the workplace. Leaders who can do the work on themselves, growing the emotional capacity to stay the course towards racial justice in the face of resistance. And leaders who commit to working on their own internalized racial biases whilst modeling and supporting the growth of effective anti-racist practices in others. Practice shift 3. We need to practically acknowledge the fact that racism causes harm, and therefore people require time and space to heal. Staff who endure discrimination often feel overwhelmed or experience trauma, but they look and find little support available for them for their healing. These are conversations that staff understandably are reluctant to talk about openly. Trauma-informed leadership practices are required for workplace cultures to promote health and well-being for all of their staff. So in closing, racial equity is only ever intersectional. Initiatives for change need to start from that space. No social problem is ever solved if we're not talking about it. Creating cultures with racial equity, in which racial equity is the expectation, is within the gift of health and care leaders. That's all of us. But we'll need to be brave. In the words of Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley, we have the capacity to choose differently. So let's choose differently. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy.
Well, the very least I can do is be quick, so that there's time for us to have a conversation. So this agenda is very central to the work of the Confederation, our EDI team under Joan Sadler, the fact that we proudly host the Race and Health Observatory, the work of NHS employers. One of the first things that I did when I came to the Confed was develop a set of impact goals, and one of those impact goals is specifically focused on our commitment to support NHS leaders in tackling health inequalities. So in my incredibly brief comments, I want to use the framework that we'll be using in our new anti-racism strategy that we'll be publishing next week. And that framework is around kind of 3 ideas: understanding, commitment, and action. So understanding means that we need to understand not only the manifestation of exclusion and inequality by looking at the data, listening to lived experience, of understanding what drives that. That's why I commend, for example, the work of the Race and Health Observatory, which is often about trying to understand why it is that we have unequal outcomes. And I also think part of that understanding is about a willingness to have difficult conversations around challenging issues. So understanding is do we really know what is going on in our organizations? Do we really know what's going on in relation to staff, in relation to health inequalities? By the way, I'm putting together the challenge of EDI in relation to employment and our commitment to tackling health inequalities, because I actually think those two agendas have a lot of synergy. We need to think about them together. So understanding is the first. Then commitment, and for me commitment is around seeing EDI as being integral to our model of change. It is integral to the idea of getting the most out of our colleagues, to how we recruit, how we retain, how we motivate. It's not an addition to that strategy, it's at the core of that strategy. And equally, it is an essential part of how we meet the health needs of our population. In essence, what I mean by commitment is that this is just the way we do things. It's not something we do at the margins, it's not something we do occasionally, it is simply the way in which we act as a good employer, and it is simply the way in which we act in terms of meeting population health needs. And then thirdly, action, because understanding and commitment is fine, but in the end it has to turn into action. And until the golden day when there is no evidence of exclusion, we need, it seems to me, to do three things consistently. We need to demonstrate that in all our work we are sensitive to issues of exclusion and discrimination. So that is part of how we look at every challenge, whether it's reconfiguring services or innovation. How do we look at that through an EDI lens? That's the first part. The second is, are we taking specific initiatives to tackle specific challenges? So because we've got that understanding, what are the concrete issues and what are we concretely doing to address particular forms of exclusion, particular challenges that we have? And I think if we don't have an agenda, if we can't say, look, here's a specific challenge we identified and here's a specific program that's seeking to do something about that, then there's something missing in terms of action. And then finally, how do we remain vigilant to new challenges and new opportunities? And I think the most obvious recent one has been the cost of living crisis. And I would commend, it seems to me, if you look at the NHS Employers website, you'll see this fantastic work that you have undertaken to support your staff, and particularly more disadvantaged staff, more challenged staff in terms of socioeconomic circumstances, in terms of the cost of living crisis. And, you know, there are limits to what we can do because of the overall pay situation, but incredible imagination that has been undertaken by you as leaders, addressing what you see in terms of that cost of living crisis for your staff and also for your patients. So, you know, this is an unfolding agenda, but, you know, actually overall I would say, you know, as someone who's come into the service from the outside just 18 months ago, I am impressed by how deep the commitment to this is, but we just have to see it as part of business as usual. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Tricia. Oopsie.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Tricia Pereira, Director of Operations at Skills for Care. More recently, I was Head of Adult Social Care in a local authority in the London Borough. And I'm also a member of the Messenger Implementation Group. So I just wanted to also start with some data around the workforce. But as we know, research shows that inclusive cultures free from discrimination, places where people feel that they belong and feel supported, can lead to improved organisational effectiveness. And my colleagues have covered some of that already. And this is why we welcome being part of the Messenger Review into leadership and the need to embed inclusive leadership practice and promote the values of equity, equality, diversity and anti-racism in leadership. And as I said, I just wanted to share a bit of data around the social care workforce and the demographics. So there are 1.5 million people working in social care, and people from ethnic minority communities account for 1 in 5 of the adult social care workforce in England, and we play a vital role in the day-to-day care of people in our communities. So in 21-22, the workforce was more diverse than the population of England. And we know that workers from Black, African, Caribbean, Black British backgrounds accounted for over half of the Black, Asian and minority ethnic adult social care workforce. Regionally, there are large variations, with London having the most diverse workforce at 68%, and the North East, the least diverse workforce at 5%. In general, these proportions reflect the population in each area. And this information, it includes workforce data for local authorities and the independent sector only at this stage. So the proportion of workers with a Black, Asian or ethnic minority background has increased slowly over the period, from 20% of all workers in 2012-2013 to 23% in 21-22, and 12% of all managerial roles in 2012 to 16% currently. And with the ongoing trend in international recruitment, this will continue to grow. So, however, there are differences in diversity between job roles. Notably, there are proportionally more males and more white people in senior roles. The root cause of this difference can't be ascertained from the workforce data alone. However, it's a concern because it indicates, or it could indicate, a lack of equal opportunity or discrimination in the sector. As a social worker, that's my professional background, anti-racist, anti-oppressive, anti-discriminatory practice, that's all inherent to my ethical value base and our code of practice. However, this concept is often applied when referring to delivery of services and supporting people who draw on care and support, and at times not really applied to the colleagues, to the workforce, to people that we work alongside. And we cannot continue to allow these concepts to be hollow words. But over the last couple of years, many employers and organisations have been reflecting and acknowledging on how to address systemic racism and how to be actively anti-racist, recognising that simply not being racist is not enough. I have seen this particular framework being used by a variety of organisations. And it's helping them to think about where they currently are and to reflect on their workforce demographics and who occupies the senior roles. And it's helping them to tackle the internal processes, systems and structures that perpetuate systemic racism, supporting the underpinning work to be actively anti-racist. Of course, this is an ongoing journey, and the aim is to reach the growth zone and consistently remain in that area. And much of the work takes place in the learning zone. So educating ourselves around the experiences of workers and having to have those so-called uncomfortable or clumsy conversations. You owe it to your workforce to put the work in, to do the learning, to make the effort, to make a difference. As we know, the Messenger Review calls for EDI to have a more central role in leadership training and for a set of uniform standards for equal opportunities and fairness across health and social care, at entry level and at mid-career level. And also the recent white paper, the social care white paper, has also identified EDI as a priority area. But it takes more than policy. It takes a real, authentic commitment to change behaviours. And as the Secretary of State said earlier, it's far better to show, not tell. And at Skills for Care, we're developing and promoting tools and resources to help employers implement inclusive and positive organisational structures, including in partnership with the Department of Health, developing and rolling out the social care workforce race equality standards, and the development of competencies and behaviours which will allow us to monitor, progress and drive up standards of practice from across the sector. So promoting diverse leadership and supporting managers with adopting a compassionate leadership approach with the culture that encourages well-being and progression, and that's key to building a safe and supportive workplace culture. So over the years, we've had our Moving Up programme, and that's grown in popularity. And we've also developed the Forefront programme, and that's a pre-course programme to Moving Up, and that supports diverse leadership development. But it's not just for managers, it's aimed at people who are working in direct caregiving roles or on the forefront or who are at the start of their leadership journeys. So we're trying to establish that transformational change within people's career pathways. But this is just one element of the work that we're doing at Skills for Care to support the diverse workforce in social care and those aspiring into leadership roles. We have the new directors programme, the alumni networks, because we know that people who occupy those senior leadership roles are often just one or one of two within the organisations. So how can we support them to thrive and grow and not just survive in those roles? And as leaders, our offer supports you to understand not only your place in the system, but how you can influence and shape the workplace cultures. So inclusive leaders embark on a lifelong journey of self-discovery. It's not just the theoretical concepts. You actually have to put these into practice. They have to be felt and understood within each of the organisation. And as leaders, you must understand your own biases and assumptions that shape decision-making. So we need to support leaders to see the world through an inclusive lens, to really have that understanding of their self and to have a real commitment to equity and inclusion, and to stand up as advocates and allies to people who are facing discrimination on a day-to-day basis, not to be just a bystander. And we've recruited our head of leadership, Christine Wint, if you can just raise your hand, Christine, show where you are. Thank you. Who's going to help us really progress this work. So as leaders in the room today, we are in a unique position to make a difference to hundreds of employees and hundreds of people who access our support and our care and our services. This really is a human rights movement, a social justice movement, and I can't wait at the Q&A session, I can't wait to hear from you the difference that you're wanting to make and the steps that you are taking. These are some of the areas of inclusive leadership practice that Tracy has covered. So I didn't want to go over those because, Tracy, you said them so well, so eloquently. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tricia. And Peter.
Right, good morning, everyone. As I hope some of you know, today's the first day of Disability History Month 2022, so I hope a few of you will be wearing your purple ribbons during this month and celebrating particularly on World Day of Disability, which is 3rd of December. Get those purple flags up in your trusts. So I'm going to start off, because it is a History Month, with a reflection on the past, and we'll start off with an apology that these are all white men. We could discuss that later. But they were also very successful war leaders, and they were also, as you all know, seriously disabled. You all know about Nelson having only one eye, one arm. You all know about Churchill's black dog, his serious depression. And you all know about the polio, which left Roosevelt in a wheelchair, but didn't stop him being a great peacetime and wartime leader. So I stand before you as the co-chair of the Disabled NHS Directors Network. Some of our members in the audience, we were formed 2 years ago. We now have about 50 members. We're the first national network for people with disabilities in the NHS. We, at the moment, are only open to board members because that allows us to punch at a particular level. But we do include a very wide range of disabilities, ranging from autism through visual, hearing, mobility, mental health, long-term conditions, and other impairments as well. And we also have a very good range of ethnicity, gender, and geographical coverage. Can I talk to you, though, a little bit about some rather alarming statistics about disability in the NHS? And most of these come from a report which I hope all of your boards have discussed, which is the Workforce Disability Equality Standard Report, which you all have to contribute to, and obviously there is a national report. So 20% of the working age population of the UK have a report that they have a disability. In the NHS, only 3.7% of board members report they have a disability. And then when you probe into what goes on in trusts, nearly 2/3 of trusts have no disabled board members. 20% of the NHS workforce, when they're able to report whether they're disabled or not anonymously in the staff survey, identify as disabled. When they have to report and put their name to it, to their employer on ESR, 3.7%. That number's creeping up, and there's huge variation between trusts. And I hope, when you go back to the ranch, you'll find out what your figure is in your trust and whether you need to do something very actively about it. Now, I recognise there are all sorts of statistical differences here in terms of staff survey not being 100%, etc., etc. So we're not comparing exactly like for like, but a 6-to-1 ratio makes you think. Why do our staff, and if these figures are right, We're talking 200,000 NHS staff. Fear to identify to their employers that they're disabled. I leave that thought with you. You may want to look at it in your own organisation. And a lot of this, I have to say, is not about people like me who've been disabled since I was 5 months old, coming in, always being disabled as they build their careers. Recognise that 80% of disabled people become disabled during their working life. So this is about supporting people to continue careers. And that's why that statistic at the bottom about putting people into the capability process is also something you need to think about. Let's be more positive. This is about inclusion, but it's also about celebrating what difference and diversity can bring to the NHS in leadership. With respect to disability, disabled leaders bring lived experience. And if there's any organisation in Europe which needs lived experience at the top more, please tell me about it, because remember, and these are WDES figures, 70% of the patient activity of the NHS is actually supporting disabled patients. It depends on how you calculate it. We need more disabled leaders to strengthen the voice of disabled patients in NHS decision-making. This is really important. That's our day job, looking after disabled people. So we need disabled leaders with lived experience. But it'll also encourage our workforce to value difference. And having disabled role models through the organisation matters in terms of people feeling confident about coming out as disabled. But also, as we move to a world of collaboration, diversity generally, intersectional diversity, is something we should relish more than ever, because diversity brings different opinions, it brings different thoughts. Diverse leaderships are better at collaboration. There's a business case too. 20% of the workforce are disabled. Well, if you don't tap into those, you're missing out on a lot of high-quality applicants. And then there's a final thing. Being disabled is a great management training scheme. If you're disabled, almost every moment of every day, in one respect or another, you're having to tackle problems which are associated with your disability. You have to find efficient ways of dealing with them. This isn't about being courageous or brave or anything like that. It's just being practical. What a great training scheme to be an NHS leader. And finally, I just want to leave you with a thought. And I don't totally buy into this myself. I buy into it partly. The social model of disability recognises that people are disabled by the attitudes of society rather than by their impairments. Now, there's a limit to that. I'd be pretty useless as a porter or an acute ward nurse or running for a crash trolley. But I can do other jobs in the NHS, and I have done for a rather long time. And the NHS, I have to say, does need to think about what is the dominant paradigm in its organisation. All too often, as employers, and this comes out of HR and occupational health departments and out of managerial cultures, it's prove to us that you can do, or for those 80% who develop disabilities during their careers, continue to do the job. We need to reverse that. It should be, how can we enable you to have or continue to have a great career in the NHS with us? And I have to say, in my own organisation, this week, I've seen two completely opposite examples. One, absolutely wonderful, supporting someone who's lost their sight during their time with us, who actually has got promoted and is developing her career even further. And we celebrated her in our Monday morning blog this week because it's Disability History Month. Then we have an autistic member of staff who HR are saying, thank goodness, he's resigned. Well, actually, I've asked them to reverse that and look at it again, because we should not be celebrating when particularly people with hidden disabilities, particularly autism, neurodiversity and mental health issues, leave the organisation. All too often we do that. It takes away a management problem. Should we be looking harder at how we can support them? And perhaps we can discuss that later. Finally, DNDN. If you're a board member who identifies publicly or privately as disabled, come and join us. Thank you.
thank you all so much. Before I go to audience questions, there's one kind of key thing, and I'll start with you, Peter, on this, because you raised it so beautifully, and you talked about the whole way the NHS needs to reverse the way it thinks about inclusion, particularly on issues of disability. Is what specific work do all of you see being done to address underrepresentation at senior levels in the NHS? Do you want to take that first?
Yes, I think, I mean, with respect to disability, but I think there are lots and lots of examples with respect to race or gender or LGBTQ plus staff. With respect to disability, it's actually making the organisation visibly disabled friendly. And that's not just putting a disability confident logo on the bottom of your stationery. That's a pretty meaningless symbol, to be honest, if you examine it. The threshold for achieving it is pathetic. What you should be doing is looking at, do you have a disability leave policy? And there are some really good examples around the NHS. Mersey Care, Notts Healthcare. I'm working through that in my own trust at the moment to get a really good one, but some trusts are allowing 5 days. What do you do about reasonable adjustments? Do you have a central budget to support reasonable adjustments for physical changes? And do you also have access to a database for example, assisted software and so on? And finally, what are you doing around reasonable adjustments in terms of thinking, how do you support your own teams to look after and keep someone with a hidden disability, particularly autism or mental health issues? And that's the tricky one. These things play out at local level in a team of medical secretaries or a ward or whatever. It's all very well people like me at the top saying, do this, do that. But actually the people have to work with, support and nurture, and the individuals who may be struggling with their health or their disabilities are at a local level. They often don't have the skills or the training and so on. So think about those three things.
Thank you. Tricia next. So I'm quickly interested in what you see being done to include people at senior level.
As I was saying, it's not just supporting people to access learning, development and training. It's being influenced the workplace cultures of the organisation as well. So as Peter was talking about, I was just reflecting and saying, if the culture in the organisation is one, as leaders, you're truly modelling the inclusiveness so that people can feel that they belong, they feel supported, and they're able to speak and talk out and they're listened and heard from, then that makes a wealth of difference. It also that enhances the reputation of the organisation as well, and people will be attracted to take up roles and to take positions, because not only will they see the diversity in senior leadership roles, so then they can aspire into those roles if they see people at that level, but also they know that they will feel welcomed to join those organisations as well.
Tracy and then Christina and then Matthew.
You've just taken the words out of my mouth. I think that the one thing that I will say is, in order to improve representation, this is leadership behaviours. The responsibility is on our leaders, that's all of us in this room. And if we are not challenging ourselves, scrutinising our own decision making, putting into practice new ways of thinking, talking to our staff and learning from them, we will not create the cultures that will be sustainable and increase representation at a senior level. It's down to us.
Thank you, Christine.
And I think there's something about this, we have to get into the really uncomfortable nature about some of the experiences and lack of opportunities of our staff and our workforce. And it isn't, and we know it, don't we? All the things that we're hearing today and for some time aren't new. So what's the block? What's stopping? What's the action that needs to be taken? And of course, the messenger review, beautifully crafted, very insightful, details that. But what are the really difficult, uncomfortable conversations? We need to get behind all the plans and the metrics and not only see the change in behaviour, but just see the change in the paradigm, like you're saying, Peter, and the makeup of our workforce. And that's about really hearing those very, very difficult stories that are present in our organisations today. It's about having those really uncomfortable moments, as well as celebrating the highlights of where we can see it really working.
Thank you, Matthew.
I'll just make one simple point in terms of time, which is, I think as leaders, and I say this as someone who leads an organisation myself, I think a question we might want to ask ourselves is, if we were to ask our colleagues, what they saw as being priorities for us as leaders, would they identify equality, diversity and inclusion as one of the priorities of us as leaders? And if I ask that question of myself, I think the answer probably is not as, I wouldn't be sure, to put it that way, which means there's a lot more work for me to do within my own organisation. So I just give you that as a simple kind of measure as a leader. If your colleagues were asked what your priorities were, would they include EDI as something which they associate you with? I think that's an interesting question for us to reflect on.
So one thing I'll follow up with, and I'll start with you, Matthew, on this is, as a journalist, I get approached a lot by people within the NHS with their negative experiences. And the number of times over the years I have met people who hold senior roles, often clinical roles, describing to me the racism they've experienced or different kinds of sexism, different kinds of discrimination. It depresses me so much. And what I hear again and again is that within the system there is a hierarchy, that there are unspoken rules, that you can get so far and not beyond. And I'm fascinated for your opinions on, despite all these great examples you've given and ideas about how we can make it work better, why I don't anecdotally still see that in reality translating better for people within the NHS who should be holding senior leadership roles from different backgrounds and diversities. Do you want to take that one first, Matthew? Especially someone who's coming from outside, what do you see?
I think I'd connect it to a broader cultural challenge for the NHS that I observe as someone who's still just a little tiny bit of an
And dare I say, the fact that you hold the role you do, come from outside, I think that in itself is quite interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think what I'd observe about the culture of the NHS, it reflects a conversation I had with someone the other day who's been doing some work we're doing in the Confed around system leadership, and they reflected a conversation they'd had with a group of system leaders when they kind of said, what kind of leadership do you want to offer? And they said, well, leadership that's empowering and that's facilitative and enabling. Great. And then the next question was, what will you do if something goes wrong? And the problem was that when something goes wrong, we immediately reach for a kind of command and control kind of mentality. Now, the problem about the NHS is there's always something going wrong. That's just the nature of the fact that we've got an incredibly challenging job, and, it ain't going to become any less challenging in the immediate future. So I think one of the challenges is that we have a set of values for the good times, and too often we kind of set those aside when it feels as though we're under pressure. We're always under pressure. When things are going wrong, things are always going wrong. When we've got other priorities, there are always other priorities. So that is the step I think we have to make, which is to genuinely believe that those values are the values we use to respond to pressure, to respond to crisis, to deal with things going wrong. And I think that's the step that is really hard for leaders to take, because it requires a deep belief that those behaviours are the best way to solve problems.
No, well said, especially because of the whistleblowing aspect that I often notice when people have tried to challenge something. Did you want to go next?
I agree with everything that's been said, but just to emphasise, values really matter in this. But remember, there's the business case. And that's where I think you can sort of stop slipping back by remembering the business case around EDI in terms of making the organisation work better, tapping into greater talent and so on. So long as you can keep that, then the risk of slipping back, I agree with you about those sort of, the instinctive slip back to command and control, but I think you've got more protection if you remember that there is a business case.
Yeah, I will say that, every woman on this panel knows how many decades of women in business been saying the business case for women in leadership. We wouldn't have had the 2008 crash if we'd had more women on Wall Street, but, I'm fascinated by how the business case is never that important. And I'd be really interested to see if the NHS can finally kind of add that to it too. Who wants to go next?
I think for me,
go ahead,
there
Tracy.
is something about what is the history that got us to here. And historically, we have had too lower standards. I think I alluded to it when I was talking. We haven't had standards that we've held our leaders to on EDI. We need to raise those standards, and then we need to hold leaders to account for making progress on EDI year on year. It needs to be a performance measure, and when leaders fail to be able to meet those performance measures consistently, we need to do something about that, because we talk about EDI as though it is Well, it is
A
an
nice to
improvement
have.
tool. It's an improvement tool, but we behave as though it's a nice to have.
Yeah.
And I think that inconsistency, we just need to join those dots and hold our leaders to account, because a 2-year-old boy, Awab Ishak, died. He died because of poverty and mould. This is in Britain today. That's not acceptable. And when our leaders are not in touch with the realities on the ground in terms of the communities that they're serving, when our ICSs are detached from that kind of lived experience of real people just trying to make a living day by day, things go drastically wrong. So I think there is something about each leader having a responsibility to do their own learning, equipping themselves, and then the system creating standards and measures and holding people to account for those standards and measures.
Well said. I was thinking of that little boy's mother saying yesterday that if, you know, they hadn't been from the community they were from an African background,
Absolutely.
they might have been listened to.
Absolutely.
Christina, did you want to add something?
Yeah,
go ahead, and then
thank
Tricia.
you. There's a piece of work that's quite old now by a lady called Margaret Heffernan around willful blindness. And it talks about hope over reality. So we're hopeful that things will change. And actually it was around the Enron disaster where it was very, very clear that there was a catastrophe waiting to happen. But the board and the metrics and the measures were hopeful. You know, they were hopeful. They only wanted to hear that it was going to be okay. And in some ways, it's very, very instructive for where we are now around really this isn't just about a hopeful scenario, a hopeful situation. The link between the outcomes for our patients and citizens and an inclusive leadership culture are beyond reproach. They're there for many years, for many decades. So it's about how we use the regulatory system to support and hold people to account. How we all support each other, because an inclusive culture isn't just a workplace culture, this is a life culture, and hence some of the reasons why I wanted to show my brother-in-law Colin is you don't step into work and step out of work. This is a way of behaving and being sustained, painful, hard graft, hard work with outcomes. And just finally, when I talk to colleagues, the same colleagues that you have mentioned about glass ceilings, and if you think about the nursing workforce, it's particularly prevalent there as well, is they say to me, stop asking me what I am going to do about it. Yeah. So we put people on fabulous programs, and I can think of some fantastic programs that you've cited. Is what are you going to do about it? How are we going to have the mechanism so that we move the centre of the issue from the individual to the organisation and the system?
Did you want to add anything to that?
Everything that has been said, I'm not sure what I could add, but it is around accountability, it is around values, and it's at the time that we are recruiting leaders into those roles. Are we recruiting people with the right values? At the end of the day, we are in we're in the business of supporting people. This is occupations that are, it's relationship-based practice. So at the heart of it has to remain working with individuals, supporting individuals, having that kindness, compassionate leadership, and that will then should be modelled out because the outcomes would be better for people who are using our caring and support and services.
Can we take questions? We've got time for a couple from the audience, so if we could, I might need to raise the lights a little. Do we have our roving microphones? Yes, I can see. Was that a number 2 over there? Yes, there's definitely one down here. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, my name is Nick Catuno. I'm a correspondent at the Health Service Journal. Just to pick up on what Tracy just said about raising standards on EDI, what standards do you think specifically should be raised to make sure that EDI is not a nice to have, as you mentioned? Is there anything that stands out that NHSC or the NHS in general should be looking at to raise as a performance measure to ensure that EDI is not this nice to have? Thanks.
Thank you. Tracy,
so this is a gap, I think, that we can fill. And when we were on the Messenger Review team, and I know Christina and I have talked about this extensively, that it's the innovation that's required in an area of work that we haven't really had a lot of innovation in for years. George Floyd was a real wake-up call, I think, for the world and for the country. And because the conversations are so far behind the practice that is needed to change and transform our systems, what we first of all need to do is to understand what the issues are. So part of this is about going right back to the recruitment. What are we recruiting on the basis of? Are we properly testing people coming into the system and having a standard that says you need to be able to demonstrate that you understand this issue, you have worked in this issue, you are creating change in this issue before you get in the door? That's one standard. Then there's something about what happens with people in professions, you know, and with each profession we need to have professional standards around EDI in terms of what we expect of our workforce and of our leaders in that space. And I think that this is the area of work that we need to grow, and then we need to test with all of you, because you're the people who have to make this work, you know, and when we test it, you know, we can be in this together and work towards closing those gaps on health inequalities, not just for our communities, but for people in the workforce. People in the workforce are our communities, and we need to pay attention to what's happening to their health in the workforce just as much as people out there, because if we're making people ill, we're making work for the NHS, and we really don't need that right now.
Any other thoughts on this, the panel? I'll go to one more question. Matthew.
Just say very briefly that when I speak to ICS leaders, I see deep commitment.
Absolutely.
And there's been a real shift in relation to population health and tackling health inequalities. And listening to the Secretary of State this morning outlining what sounded to me like an attempt to move to a situation where we have a smaller number of key outcomes for systems and then a greater devolution to systems. Yes. That is, I think, a framework that it could be powerful in this relation. So we need very clear set of outcomes. We need very public data so that systems that are not succeeding can see that they're not succeeding, can be held to account. But then we need to allow, I think, as much diversity of practice and learning, because the challenges of inclusion vary enormously from place to place. So we want to create a kind of ferment of innovation and exploration and research, where there's an enormous amount of learning taking place.
Absolutely.
But then we've got to be held to account for the fact that ultimately, year by year, we are closing those health inequalities. And as I say, as the organisation that represent ICSs, I think systems would absolutely welcome that kind of framework.
Peter.
Yeah, I'm very encouraged by the CQC stepping up its focus on EDI, and my network had a very good meeting with Ian Trenholm, the Chief Executive of CQC, only last month, and there's a real focus on that. So NHS leaders, speaking as a jobbing chief exec, we respond to targets from the centre. We also respond to what the CQC is going to come in and ask and look at and publish. So I think the CQC has a really important role in this. So I just play them in.
Fine. And final thoughts, I did if Christina and she wanted to add anything.
Yeah, the Messenger review found some examples of really superb practice, and where EDI and inclusion in some ways isn't a separate. It isn't something that's it isn't an add-on. It isn't a separate. It's an integrated. It's a way of how we work around here, how we do things around here, and through the stocktake, actually, every single ICS has a level of equality, diversity, inclusion, leadership and development, training and education. So I believe you're right. The opportunity there for the ICS is huge in this regard, the potential to coalesce all the great work that you're doing, but also to shine a light where it's not going as well, or where people's lived experiences are different from where we think it's going well. I think the integrated system is a really great opportunity to accelerate, because there are some great practices out there. Again, I go back to the review and the centre of the review around a strengths-based great practices, but it is patchy, and how to eliminate that.
And Tricia, finally.
And just to follow that through, for me, again, it's about the behaviours. It's about having those authentic behaviours that we are, as leaders, we feel confident and comfortable demonstrating and sharing, because if we are behaving in a certain way, that should be modelled and rippled throughout the organisations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much. I thought even in the limited amount of time we had, I thought we really touched something quite important at the heart of this, because we talk about diversity all the time, but the reality of the difference between the talk and it being embedded in the NHS and why it matters has been really valuable. Thank you all. Just before you leave, I just want to tell you what we're going to do next. We're going to end this session with a short word from Saffron Caudry, who's going to update us on the latest step that NHS providers have taken towards their goal of becoming an actively anti-racist organisation. So thank you to my panel, but I'm delighted to welcome Saffron to the stage.
Thank you, Samira. And it's just, I won't detain you too long, but we just wanted to highlight to you that we are taking another important step towards our goal of becoming an anti-racist organisation with the publication at this conference of our anti-racism statement. And you can find this on our website. We've developed this statement with our staff, and it's for our staff, it's for the organisation and for our members. And it is underpinned by an action plan which sets out in details the steps that we are going to take for progress, along with some measures of success. And it complements, and I think this is the really important point, it complements our growing programme of support for trust boards to help you effectively identify and challenge race inequality as a core part of your business. And the reason why that's so important was that we knew that we had to do the work on ourselves before we could support you as trust boards. So I commend the statement to you. Please have a look at it and the action plan that goes with it. But we think that we've got a unique opportunity at NHS providers working with you, our members, to support the development of a truly anti-racist NHS. And, you know, they're steps that we're determined to take, and we have published those in our statement today. Thank you.
So that brings to an end our plenary sessions of the morning. Thank you to all our speakers, to you for your questions. It's time for refreshments. So please make your way to the exhibition hall. Teas and coffees will be served until 11:35. The Delivering with Partners sessions will be taking place in the satellite theatres during the breaks. Please do attend these sessions. I know people have been finding them really valuable. And they'll be followed by the third set of breakout sessions. And please do visit the exhibition stands and the NHS Providers Deliver area, and we'll all be back in this room at 1:35 for the closing sessions of the conference, where we'll hear from the Health Education England Chief Executive and NHS England Chief Workforce Officer, Navina Evans, and also NHS England Chief Executive Amanda Pritchard. I'll see you then. Thank you. It's like